Good morning, church. Such a good song. Better reality if it's in our lives versus just lyrics that we sing. And just praying that that would be true, that we would be a people who would make room, that God would not just be something we sing about, but someone that we pursue and make room. And I just was praying back there that that'd be the case for us right now and today and in our lives. So excited to have another Sunday. Every Sunday is a good Sunday here at Rise City, right? How cool was that video of the Marquardt family? I looked at Ralph Goodrich, looked at me and was like, can you believe we could be a part of a church like this? And I was like, I know, it's awesome. Your generosity is amazing, and excited to see how God continues to work through that. This past week, I had a chance to be in Dallas, Texas. Don't worry, I wasn't looking to move, just saying hi to all the people who had. I was there for a pastor's conference and church planters, and great time. Smaller group of people, but a lot of guys that were my friends I've already met. Got to meet some new people, was super encouraged and inspired by church planters that I met. They're getting ready to plant churches in some of the hardest, most difficult places in the United States to plant churches, and it's like, man, I love your heart for the kingdom, and so I was inspired by that. And anytime I'm in that setting, what inevitably happens in the midst of when you meet someone new and there's introductions, there's two common sentiments that come in my direction when I tell people I'm from San Diego. Because these are people from all over the United States, and so you're like, oh, hi, my name's Brandon. Oh, where are you at? Oh, I'm in San Diego. And the first thing is, whoa, wow, San Diego. Man, that's amazing. Suffering for Jesus, huh? Which is kind of a underhanded comment, and so I've just got used to it. I'm like, yeah, hey, someone's got to, so I'm smarter than you. So I come right back at him. And then the second comment that I get right after that is, so tell me, California, what's that like? Is it crazy? And my go-to with that is yeah, it's the wild, wild west. It really is. And so I say that over and over again and just kind of let it be. But for whatever reason, introduced myself to this guy this week and, San Diego, Sober for Jesus. Yeah, someone's got to do it and all that. And then, so California, what's that like? It's the wild, wild west. And then I hadn't thought about it, but maybe it's because I'm with pastors and some cheesy Christian joke. I was like, yeah, it's a place that John the Baptist would fit in, and they're like, and I was like, score one for me. You laughed. And if you grew up in church, you're familiar with John the Baptist, perhaps you know why I said that, because John the Baptist or John the Baptizer sometimes gets this reputation of being this guy who's a little bit eccentric, odd, crazy, if you will, and very unique, which is California, right? That's most people. We love trying to set ourselves apart here, and here's really why people think John the Baptist was a little bit eccentric and crazy. And it's really just this one verse. This is Mark chapter 1, verse 6, and we're told John's clothes were woven from coarse camel hair, and he wore a leather belt around his waist, and for food he ate locust and wild honey. So because of his attire and what he wore, he had camel clothing, leather belt, and because of his diet, because he liked, the high protein of some locust and honey, we think that dude's nuts. He's crazy, he's out there. All the while forgetting at times, oh, by the way, he was Jesus' earthly relative. And so when I think about those things, when I said, oh yeah, he'd fit in California, it was just a joke. But then I started to think more about this whole thing with John the Baptist. Why do we think he was kind of out there? And it was that verse, but then when you start looking at the ways that John the Baptist is depicted in different movies and films throughout, the last probably, 50 years, it kind of reinforces this notion of craziness. I just did a simple Google search, John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, and here are some images of the way he has been portrayed. I want to show you one at a time, and you're like, oh, wow, that's why I think he's crazy. Show the first one. If you put the first one up here, look at that. I think this is from the Gospel of Matthew film. He looks someone like you'd encounter, in downtown San Diego who's homeless. You're like, oh, that's John the Baptist. Jesus had a really interesting relative. Here's another one. Show this one. I'm pretty sure that's Tom Hanks in Castaway. I'm thinking, that guy can't even speak whatever language. He just groans. Here's another one. That looks like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson let himself go, or something. That's John the Baptist. He forgot to wear a shirt, right? Or the most popular movie right now, or film, displaying or portraying the life of Jesus is The Chosen, which I love The Chosen and excited. Season 3 is coming out. They're going to release the first couple episodes in movie theaters. I love it. But they call him in that show Creepy John. Check this out. Does that not look like a meth addict? Right? That's how he's portrayed. So when I just said, California, it's the Wild Wild West, John the Baptist would fit in there. I mean, that's why. It's because these types of images are in my mind. But have you ever got to the end of your day and you're kind of replaying it and thinking about how the day went, and sometimes you're replaying what you said? I was doing that, and I was thinking where did the John the Baptist comment come from? And it just made me begin to start looking at John the Baptist. I was by myself in a hotel room, and I was I got to write a sermon, and so I started looking at John the Baptist. And over the next day and a half, I'm not sure if John the Baptist looked like any of those guys. I mean, he may have been Creepy John for all we know. But when I started really looking into his life more, I think we've missed making him an example of someone to follow and dismissed him as someone who's just a little bit out there. And I'm more convinced now than I have been that I don't know if he would fit in California, to be honest. And I don't know if he'd fit in anywhere in the Western world in the church today. Because the intensity and the craziness of love he had for Jesus and the advancement of the kingdom, I personally was challenged by that. Do I possess that? And so I just started kind of just looking at some different episodes from his life and taking some notes and saying, man, Lord, we're going to talk about make room. Make room and do whatever you want. God, what I want is I want some of these attributes and elements that I see in the life of John the Baptist, not for me to dismiss because he's some crazy guy with, camel clothes and eats locusts, but rather get past that and let's look at this guy's life. And so that's what I want to do for a few moments. I want to look at just a couple different defining qualities of John the Baptist. And I want to just ask, are they definitive perhaps of your life, of my life? When we think of Christians or the church in general, do these types of distinctions really make the Church of Jesus Christ distinct today in our world? And if not, then perhaps we should be looking more to John the Baptist, Creepy John, Tom Hanks' Castaway version, whatever, but we could learn a lot from him. And, oh, by the way, Jesus said this about John. Jesus said this about John the Baptist. This is Matthew 11:11. He says, I tell you the truth, of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John the Baptist, or the baptizer. That's what Jesus said. He said, nobody's greater. This guy, I commend him. So maybe we should pay attention to him. So I'm calling today's message a walk on the wild side, all right? We're going to do a walk on the wild side. So I'd like to pray, and I'm just asking the Lord, he truly would, we would make room to do whatever you want. I'm trying to pray that more and more every day in my own life. I invite you to join with me in that. So God, in this time, I ask that you, God, as we make room, that you would speak to us through the life of this man that God maybe is misunderstood or dismissed for no reason, but one that you said is, of all the people, there's no one greater than John the Baptizer. And so, Lord, you teach us in this time through your word and through his life example, and not just teach us, but Lord, by your Holy Spirit that abides within those who believe, and God, by us looking to strength in Christ, make these types of things that defined him definitive in us. And I ask this in Jesus' name alone. Everybody said? Amen. All right. So, 4 things I want to kind of unpack, and then we'll kind of go through the continuum of John's life. The first thing that I see that really stood out to me is that John was someone that chose confession rather than conceit. That John's life was marked as being someone of confession rather than conceit. And by this word confession, what I mean is he was willing and open to confess freely that he was not the most important person there was. That he didn't decide to leverage his life around his own life, his own wants, his own desires, his own needs, but rather he saw his life as a distant second place to making Jesus' life most primary. That he wasn't interested in being first chair in the orchestra. He's like, I'll be way back there in a different chair so Jesus can sit in the primary one. I'm not sitting in the driver's seat on this one. I'll get in the trunk if I need to. But I'm going to confess freely that Jesus is truly the one we've been waiting for. And I'm going to leverage and wrap my life around him more than I ask him to leverage and wrap his life around me. This is the idea of being conceited, to be arrogant, boastful, proud, to put yourself front and center in every single circumstance. That was not John's story. He openly and freely confessed Jesus. Let me show you where this comes from. This is John chapter 1, verse 19 through 23. It says, "Now this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. He did not fail to confess, but he confessed freely, 'I am not the Messiah.' I am not the Messiah." They asked him, "Then who are you? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." Finally, they said, "Well, then who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" And John replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, "I am the voice of the one calling in the wilderness, make straight the way for the Lord." When John was asked about who he was and who he represented, he didn't hijack that moment and to say, because you're thinking I might be the promised Messiah. He could have easily in that moment begin to say, "Oh, maybe I am," or let me step into that. He said, no, "I am not," which is 3 words that are so powerful to add to your own personal repertoire for your life. Because everything about us oftentimes is "I am," and then we talk about what we are and our gifts and our strengths and all that. But he says, "I am not the Messiah. I'm not the most important person. I'm not the one that you should be pursuing. But actually my role is I'm trying to point people and be a voice to people, to point people to Jesus." When it says that he confesses and confessed freely he was not the Messiah, this word confession from the original language is this word homologeo. And it's broken up into 2 kind of main parts. The first part is homo, which means same, and then logeo, which also has its roots in the word logos, which means word. So to confess literally was to say the same word as another, or to agree with another. So when John comes and he says, "I am not the Messiah," and he confessed it freely, he was essentially saying, I am in full agreement, and I say the same words of that of Jesus, and that's what leads my life. I'm not adding to him. I'm not subtracting from it. I'm in full alignment and capitulation with Jesus because he is the Messiah. And I know this probably sounds like, well, yeah, I don't think I'm the Messiah, so okay, I'm doing fine. But if you looked at your life, and if I looked at my life, who truly is sitting on the throne? Is your life, and is my life more centered on my wants, my needs, my desires, the things that I would benefit from greatest? Or am I thinking more about being in alignment and saying the same thing of Jesus in every single realm and having him be on the throne? Because when we commit throne theft and begin to place ourselves more as the prominent position, then we find ourselves in this realm of conceit, building ourselves up, leveraging life for our own benefit. And one of the examples of that is, I think in our world today, we have become too fixated and value far too highly and too interested in our own voice and opinion over God's voice and his opinion. Have you noticed that? We love to hear ourselves talk. And we love to make what we say most prominent, and oftentimes not even say a word about what God said about whatever it is we're talking about. Whether we have our own platforms on social media, our own blog posts, or in our conversations, for some reason, we have got to a place of thinking that our opinion and our word takes priority. How did we get to that place? I wrestle with that all the time. I mean, I had this love-hate relationship, as you probably know, being here, and we talk about it with social media. There are things that I want to make sure that we talk about, and hopefully the world can hear through Christ, but then to put my face on a video clip with little words that you read, who cares what I say? If it's not in alignment or saying the same word as Jesus, then don't listen to me. Are you following? But everything now is about sound bites and clips and what do they say? And we think our opinion is the most important. And what we do is we begin to place ourselves in the center position on that throne, and we've got to be leery of that because when we look at John the Baptist, he wanted nothing to do with that. He freely confessed, I am not the Messiah. And when we look at our own life, sometimes even the way we go about life and thinking that we've got to be involved in everything or be the answer to everybody for everything or work everything out and let's be the center, really we are exhibiting a Messiah complex. Or we have people come to us to get opinions or have people come to us for advice and we don't first encourage them, go to the real Messiah first. And it's very subtle and sometimes nuanced. We've got to be very aware of this. But sometimes even in the church world right now, the most popular thing is your personal spiritual growth and health. Have you noticed that? That one of the things that's being purported in churches are like, you've got to be fully spiritually, mature, but also your spiritual health matters. And once you get to a place of being fully healthy spiritually, then you can be active in ministry. And I'm not dismissing your own personal health and wellness or your spiritual growth. I think those are important. But when that becomes the only focus of our trajectory, guess who's front and center again? Me, you, we are looking to our own lives. And so now we got to go and spend lots of money in counseling to make sure that we're whole and healthy. I'm not dismissing counseling. Or we've got to make sure and be a part of this study that's going to help me grow personally and this for me. And all the while, it's like, did you realize that a part of the Christian life is you find your life when you give your life away? A part of your maturity as well as your growth and wellness and health is when you serve and love others, and as they're ministered to, you also are ministered to. But if we're not careful, we can baptize that conceit as being somehow honorable. Versus to freely confess of no. John gave everything he had to making a path straight in the wilderness so people could hear the voice of the Lord. And that's challenging to me. That's inspiring to me. And sometimes I wonder, I've asked God this week, are we leading Rise City Church in the best way? Because I want you to thrive personally. But I want us collectively to realize a part of thriving personally is to be invested in the lives of those around us. And if not, then we can quickly succumb to this notion of conceit. And we've just said it's okay because I need to be the best me and I need God to work in me and me and me and me and me. And if everything is me and not others or them too, then I think we've missed it. And John would be like, wait a minute, I don't understand that. I confess freely, openly. I say the same word of Jesus on these things. And Jesus said, I give your life away. You serve others. You forgive others. You love others. There's 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 others. And that needs to be our story as well. Second thing I see from John's life is that he chose celebration rather than critique. He chose to celebrate rather than to criticize. How did we fall in this trap of being such a critical, cynical body of believers? And I say we, I'm not talking about just Rise City Church or even Rise City Church. Of course we haven't. We're setting an example for everybody else of doing the right thing. All the other Christians out there. But sometimes the church is known more for what it critiques and criticizes than what it celebrates. And what was interesting with John is that John was able to celebrate the success of others. And in particular, we're talking about to celebrate the success of Jesus' ministry growing while his began to diminish. That his own followers began to pursue Jesus rather than stay within his ministry. But John didn't try to circumvent that, cancel Jesus, make up a bunch of garbage to try to, derail Jesus' ministry, but rather he was willing to celebrate. I want to show you this, and I think this hits home in a lot of areas for us if we were honest. John chapter 3, verses 26 and 27, it says, they came to John and they said to him, these are like some of John's own disciples, like the people he's been pouring his life into. They come to him and they say, Rabbi, that man who was with you on the other side of the Jordan, the one that you testified about, look, he's baptizing and now everybody's going to him. Jesus' church is getting bigger than yours, John. People are starting to like Jesus more than you, John. I don't think that they had altruistic and good motives when they were coming to John in this moment. To this, John replied, he said, a person can receive only what he is given them from heaven. You yourselves can testify that I said, I am not the Messiah. He's like doubling down. He's like, I told you this. I told you this. This isn't about me. I am not the Messiah, but I am sent ahead of him. He, referring to Jesus, must become greater and I must become less. John was able to see something else and someone else thrive and him actually celebrate their success versus try to cut them down. And we have, not just in the church. I don't think this is just a church phenomenon, but I experienced it at church. I mean, I was in this pastor's deal this past week in Texas. And there were some guys that when we talked about churches that were growing or recovered post-COVID and all this other kind of stuff, to hear what some of the guys said about those other churches was like, wait a minute, what? I thought we were on the same team. Oh yeah, they just started like, just cutting they just started, watering everything down, or they became all political and they did this and this and this and this and they're so much better and they think it's better, but they just took our people and all this stuff. And I quickly wanted to like join in because I have some of those same sentiments. Be like, oh yeah, that church. But I'm like that point, I am playing into, I think, the vice of what the enemy wants to do and dividing the church so it's destroyed. Versus being like, you know what? We chose a different route, and I praise God that we continue to be able to minister to people, and you know what? I am grateful, kind of Philippians chapter 1, that however Christ has preached, whatever the motive is, but he still preached, and I celebrate that. To try to get to that place in my heart. But even in our culture, whether it be for us, different family members, right? If they thrive, it's easier for us if we're not on the winning team to want to like cut them down. We do that with coworkers. Sometimes we do that with siblings, right? We sometimes do that with neighbors. We definitely do it with people sitting on the other side of the political aisle from us. That it's so polarized, and there's the inability to actually celebrate and call out at times what's good and actually celebrate somebody else. And it's just easier to be critical, which then leads to cynicism. And our culture has become far more critical and cynical. But to what good is that added? And especially in the Church of Jesus Christ. Some of you have come from other churches. And I am very grateful when you come from other churches and I talk to you and you choose not to throw the church you came from under the bus. Can I say thank you for that? Because those guys are my friends most of the time. And we're all ministering together. But when we come and be like, he did that, and they did this, and blah, 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 it's like, okay, like, I thought forgiveness was a part of the gospel too. Right? And these are just subtle ways that we've got to watch, because I do believe the enemy is alive and well and trying to divide and to destroy. And we've got to be conscious of the ways he does those types of things. How can you and how can I begin to figure out ways each day to see things that we can actually celebrate? And when someone does well, to celebrate that. And it doesn't mean you have to agree with everything else, but maybe that one thing that's worth celebrating. We do a couple different podcasts here at this church, and one of them is Digging Deeper. So every Monday we some of the staff get together, we talk about the previous message, dig deep underneath it. Last week, if you were listening, Robert interviewed Mariah. And, Mariah is just brilliant. Like when I listen to her talk, I'm like, you should preach more. But she was talking about her miscarriages and how hard it was at times for her as she continued to lose life, have other people that she got pregnant with at the same time be able to birth life. And she just talked about that it's really easy to want to start to critique and criticize and be sad about these people who were able to have a baby because you didn't. So you're not able to celebrate them having a baby because you're more fixated on you not being able to. And she just talked about, but it's entirely possible that you can hold two emotions at the same time. And then she quoted Daniel the Tiger, and now I have to talk to her about that. I was like, we don't look to Daniel Tiger for theology, Mariah. But she's just like, that came from Fred Rogers and Daniel Tiger. Like you can celebrate and grieve at the same time, but we don't like to commingle those things. And sometimes maybe you're hurt, maybe you didn't get the advantage that you thought and other things, and it's hard for you to celebrate, but it's good for your soul to celebrate nonetheless if there's something worthwhile to champion in the life of somebody else. especially someone else in the body of Christ? What would your household look like? What would your workplace look like? What would your neighborhood cul-de-sac look like, or your apartment complex look like, if celebration was actually a virtue that you said, I am going to figure out how I can be celebratory versus always critical? It might actually, with kindness, transform the landscape of that setting. I mentioned we have 2 podcasts. The other podcast was started is by Pete, and Pete started a podcast called Like Stars, and it's darn good. Like, if you haven't listened to it, you need to listen to it. It's darn good. But can I be honest, in my own insecurity, as I listen to it, I'm like, he's so much smarter than me. And I'm like, people are going to quickly start liking Pete more than they like me. And then they're going to come to him because he's got the answers, and I'm the idiot now because I'm like, I don't know, I haven't even heard of that thing. I mean, I'm listening to actually try to grow my own faith. But what I could do is start to be like, yeah. Or say, you need to be listening to his podcast. You will grow in your faith with his podcast. And celebrate that win, or celebrate the win of somebody else. We've got to do that. You need to do that, but if you got multiple kids in your family, you over-celebrate one at the expense of the other, that's going to cause problems. Be a person of celebration. Are there times to critique? Are there times to say, we're going to come to that? Yes. But you still need to add to it. Even when Jesus' ministry was getting bigger, John was like, I told you, I'm not the Messiah. Be someone who celebrates. Number 3, John chose conviction rather than conformity. And this one, man, I think this one has got to be a defining mark of the church in this next generation. Because I would say, and I'm evaluating my own life, so I'm not just condemning all of us, but we have begun to slowly drift into conformity more and more and more and compromise the convictions of what Jesus said. And so rather than this open confession of saying, I'm going to say the same thing that Jesus says on this matter, we start to, soften it, change it, shift it, and start to take the position of culture more than what Christ said this is the position, and it's always been that way. And in John's life, where I see this is, John, man, he had some boldness. And in particular, when people of his faith, and at that time, this is before Christianity started because Jesus just now come on the scene, so they're Jewish. But when there are people from his own faith that were beginning to tout things that were against the Old Testament scriptures, John was willing to stand in the gap and say, that's not right. And it probably made him extremely unpopular. I know it did with this guy named Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was one of the 8 sons of Herod the Great, and he had kind of reign and rulership of kind of the Galilean area where John was at. And what happened with Antipas was Antipas decided to sleep with his brother's wife. That's a no-no in the Old Testament, anytime, don't sleep with your brother's wife. And then he decided he liked her some more, so he took her, stole her, and she became his wife. That's another no-no. You don't do that. But Antipas was evidently representing Jews and Jewish faith. And John the Baptist is like, that's not right. You can't do that. You're saying that this is okay and your life is permitting this, but this is completely against how God called us to live. And it resulted in him having to go to jail. Check this out. This is Matthew chapter 14, verses 3-5. For Herod had arrested and imprisoned John as a favor to his wife Herodias. Herodias was sick of John opening his mouth and condemning their relationship. So she says to the husband, hey, you need to shut that guy up, because I don't want your brother anymore. I got you now. And so imprisoned John as a favor to his wife Herodias, the former wife of Herod's brother Philip. I'm sure Antipas and Philip were buddies. John had been telling Herod, it is against God's law for you to marry her. Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of a riot because all the people believed that John was a prophet. So as John is calling out Antipas' actions and saying they're against God's law, he doesn't want to hear that. Because one, he is conceited. He's not openly confessing and aligning himself with the ways of the Lord or Jesus' teachings. Now, I'm about to say something which I know could, for some, maybe in this area, you're going to like me more, and I'm not asking to like me more. I'm just making a parallel here. If you like me more, come back next week, and then you'll see. But I do see right now, and it's like a parallel is, as Antipas is probably one of the highest ranking officials in that region, saying he's a Jew, saying that he abides by God's law, but then lives a life that's very counter to that. I see some reflections in our current commander-in-chief in two realms, who says he's openly a Catholic, but yet unashamedly now advocates for abortion all the way up to the termination of the life, even once it's born. The same with transgender surgery. To say it's immoral for states to say this, that minors should have to have consent to have surgeries to change their gender permanently. I'm just saying the church that he's a part of the Roman Catholic Church, would never advocate for that. But what's happening, and don't diss on Joe Biden, look at your own life. But what's happening is, this is what I want to believe, this is what I think the culture wants me to believe, and so I'm going to start to conform that and even advocate that, and I'm going to say it's okay because this isn't like a church thing right now. But conviction says, in a political realm, in a spiritual realm, in a family realm, in an occupational realm, in every realm, it penetrates all of the realms. And conviction leads out in that. And that's not always popular. Right now, my fear is I don't want to alienate those who are Democrats, because I believe Christians are Democrats. Put that on Twitter or whatever you want. Well, Elon Musk might allow that. I don't know now. I don't know, but I believe that there are Christians on both sides, so I'm not trying to make a political aisle statement. Don't get me started with Donald Trump. So this is equal offensiveness today. Let's say, come back next week. I got a fun one next week. But here's my thing with this, guys, is just simply just saying we're okay conforming in realms and not saying the same thing as Jesus on matters when Jesus said, this is what I've spoken. In Genesis chapter 3, right, the question that's asked by the serpent to Eve when she says we're not supposed to eat of this fruit of this tree, we're allowed to eat of any other fruit. And then the serpent says, did God really say that? And we have become a culture, and Christians have become people who constantly are saying, did God really say that? Versus, God did say that, and we need to wrap our lives around that and not question that. But everything's not, did God really say that? No, maybe he didn't really mean that. Maybe that's just a time. And so we conform. And we have to be careful in that. And here's why we sometimes walk away from our conviction, is because we don't want to be offensive. Or we ourselves don't want to be offended, as if that's the greatest sin you could commit now. When the very nature of the gospel of Jesus Christ, it is said to be foolishness to the world and offensive. And if you yourself feel like the greatest sin that can be committed against you is for you to be offended, toughen up. Seriously. There's sometimes we got to step on each other's toes to say, are we walking in alignment with what the Lord has called us to? I am not advocating for you to be intentionally offensive as a big fat jerk. There's a difference. You might offend and be unbelievably loving and kind. Or the person can be unbelievably loving and kind to you and you feel offended because you don't agree with the same thing. But that doesn't mean you have to blow up. John the Baptist was willing to speak to his convictions and live them out, even when it wasn't culturally popular or relevant. That's challenging. That's challenging. I'll just leave it there. Let's go to the next point. How about that? We good? Okay. Last one. John chose devotion rather than desertion. This kind of dovetails a little bit off of what I talked about last week, where there are times that God would cause or even allow, right, for us to eat the bread of adversity or the water of affliction. And sometimes that really is hard for us, because many people today come to following Jesus and think Jesus is like a genie in the bottle, and once I get the lamp in my hand and I rub with my prayers the lantern, then he comes out and says you get 3 wishes and your life can be awesome. That's called Aladdin. And life is hard. There are many moments that you're going to probably experience adversity and affliction. And for many, because they didn't expect that, even though Jesus said, count the cost to when you're going to build a tower and you're going to follow me, you might want to know what you're getting yourself into so you don't like run out of materials when you build a tower and you actually can bring it to completion. But when the going gets tough, sometimes that's when we say this isn't worth it and we bail and we desert. And this phenomenon is nothing new in the 21st century. This was happening in the first century with Jesus. When people began to experience hardship or even hard teachings, a lot of them said, I'm out of here. John chapter 6, verse 60, as well as verse 66, says many of the disciples, this is actually when Jesus started talking about the Lord's Supper, and he starts talking about eating of his flesh, drinking of his blood. Like, that would have been weird. That would have been super weird. They didn't have communion yet. He wasn't talking about bread. They're just looking like, oh, interesting, you're a vampire. That's weird. You got to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And they're like, wait a minute, what's up with that? And it says, then some of the disciples said, this teaching is very hard to understand. How can anyone accept it? And then 6 verses later, it says, at this point, many of the disciples turned away and deserted him. I fear that a lot of people have deserted the teachings of Jesus because they either don't align with what you want him to say or they're too hard to put into practice. And I feel like as your pastor, and even for me personally, to the standard I try to hold myself to, it's a disservice if I do not share some of these types of things because they are the realistic aspects of following Jesus as Lord and King. It doesn't make it easier to go against the cultural grain. But John said he was devoted, no matter what. And he didn't bail and desert on him. But here's the thing, he struggled. What I love about John the Baptist is he was honest with his struggles. He was honest with times he started to doubt and wonder, like, man, this is just getting super hard. Like, can I keep up with this? Check this out. This is Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 through 6. This is after John has been in jail, and John knows he's probably going to lose his life because of his belief in Jesus. So he's called out Herod Antipas. He's in jail, and very soon after this, Herodias is going to ask for his head to be chopped off, and that's how he dies. But this is what he does. John the Baptist says, who was in prison, heard about all the things the Messiah was doing. So he's in jail, hears that Jesus started to have this active ministry. So he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else? Now, I thought he already said, I'm not the Messiah. I thought he said he was pointing at Jesus. Like, why is he in this moment having questions? And why is he asking, are you really the Messiah? And the reason is because you've been there. When life is hard, and this is your commitment or your conviction, but it's not going the way things you thought, don't you start asking questions like, is this worth it? Did I get this wrong? Right? I love that John's like, I'm struggling here. And so he sends some of his disciples to can you just reassure me in this? Can you just help me know? And can I just tell you, I want us to be a church that's able to, when you're struggling and there's hardship, be able to ask, is this legitimate? Am I the only one feeling this? Am I the only one right now being asked to eat my vegetables, which I talked about last week, eating the bread of adversity, the water of affliction? Like, John is like, this is hard. Can you please, Jesus, confirm to me that you are who you say you are? And Jesus then told him, you go back to John, and you tell him what you've heard and seen. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is being preached to the poor. And he added, God blesses those who do not fall away because of me. Let me finish with this. I've been kind of studying also lately, sometimes we overemphasize one thing at the expense of other things. And what I mean by that is, I think oftentimes within Christianity, the predominant metaphor that's presented these days is it's a journey. And we present it. One of our values is journey-minded. So I'm convicting myself here. I believe that, though. I mean, there's a journey, meaning that, we do not become like Christ overnight, but it's incremental over time that we are shaped and become more like Christ. I believe that's a journey. But because when we have this idea of a journey, then sometimes we get this, woo, journey, meandering, and do whatever you want, and I hope I get to where I'm supposed to be going. And we forget some of the other predominant metaphors in the New Testament. It's a race to win and a war to be fought. And those aren't easy. Particularly the idea, it's a spiritual war, which means you're going to get bumps and bruises, and at times you're going to have to disengage from the battle, and they're going to bandage you up and put you right back on the battlefield, because a day is coming, Rise City Church, when all wounds are healed. A day is coming when all tears are wiped away. A day is coming when you're no longer just exhausted and your energy is depleted, because you'll be filled and made new. A day is coming, Rise City Church, when the body that you feel like is dilapidating is restored and a new body is granted unto you. A day is coming, but before that day gets here, you need to realize it is a race to win, which means you got to run. You got to keep going. You got to take a certain pace, and you got to realize also it is a war. It's a war. If you just told Paul it was a journey, like, woo, he'd be like, what? Then why am I getting the crap knocked out of me? Why are people coming against me? Why is this happening? But he knew. His mental framework knew. This is a temporary war, but it's to be engaged on every front, and all of us are invited into it, and we're not to be in it alone, but we have each other through it. And therefore, it's a devotion. When you have an unrealistic set of expectations, it leads to desertion. John the Baptist was devoted to the very end. And yeah, his head was cut off. That's terrible. Can I just tell you, I don't want that for me. I don't want that for my wife, my kid. I don't want that. But I think John's like, yeah, my head's back on now. It's good. And so will you stand with me? I just want to invite us as we close today to perhaps consider, just like sometimes these things that we write off as crazy, maybe a little crazy is what we need right now. Crazy in terms of our confession of living for Jesus. Crazy in terms of being celebratory on a lot of matters versus critical. Maybe we need to be a little crazy in living out and being just anchored in our convictions. Maybe we need to be a little crazy in our devotion. Because at the end of the day, that's not just for you or me. It's because it's by that the world will come to see Jesus on the throne. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. We're in this together. And these last few weeks, I just felt like this is God speaking in my life. Brandon, keep going. It's a marathon. It's a war. Be kind, be humble, be loving. You are not the Messiah. You can't do this on your own. So look to him first, and let's do this with each other. May we wake up, rise, and shine. We wake up to Jesus, rise to life in him, and shine to others for him. God bless you. We'll see you next week.